Hey, everybody. Welcome to Renewalcast. We're glad you're here and glad you're listening today. Today, we have a guest with us. We're going to talk about biblical counseling. Jim Neiwheiser is with us, and we just really appreciate you joining us today and being with us. And would you just take a few minutes and introduce yourself to us? And would you in there just give us a little bit of a definition of biblical counseling? I was listening to one of your videos today, and I really appreciate it. I really appreciate that. So,
well, I don't remember what I might have said on the video, but my current position is that I am the director of the Biblical Counseling Program at Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte. And I also am the director of the Institute for Biblical Counseling and Discipleship. I spent over 30 years as a pastor prior to coming here 8 years ago. And really, it was hard to leave where I'd been for 26 years in a row to come here. Psalm 90 talks about teach us to number our days. And we were late 50s and thought, how can we best use the latter part of life, hoping God would establish the works of our hands. And so we decided we could be more useful here with an exciting new program in biblical counseling. I'm always very excited when institutions move in that direction. Biblical counseling is offering wisdom from the scriptures to help people, as Paul talked about. He wants to present everyone complete in Christ. So the premise is for spiritual problems that the best wisdom available is the Word of God. Psalm 19, he says how God's law restores the soul, enlightens the eyes, it renews the heart, and that the Bible has both power and wisdom that surpasses all else. And so biblical counseling is offering advice from the Bible so that people can not just live morally, but live out the implications of the gospel, specifically as they face various challenges in life. We also recognize there are people who have genuine medical problems, and we're not ignoring that, but our focus is helping people with spiritual problems. And even people with medical problems usually have accompanying spiritual problems, sometimes on the front end, sometimes on the back end.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Speaking about how the Bible speaks to problems and thinking about marriage and some of the problems that accompany marriage, is money part of that, part of problems in marriage? Or
I think there are a lot of marriage conflicts over money. As you're aware, I've written 3 books dealing with various financial issues. I spent my 20s in business and accounting and finance and things like that. And I would say in most cases, probably in every case, financial problems are the consequence of spiritual problems. And if it's a couple, relationship problems. I guess it's like you may be a sufferer who's been sinned against or experiencing the effects of the fall. That's not your fault because COVID hit and the government shut down your business and wouldn't give you any money, and now you're broke. Or famine hits or pestilence or whatever. But in marriages especially, I think if a couple honor and respect each other, they listen well to each other, the husband is not domineering, but is a Christ-like servant leader, and the wife respects her husband, then the particulars of financial problems, there's wisdom in the Bible that will help them. But very often what's going on is the husband and the wife have unresolved conflicts in many areas. They don't trust each other. And this is just one more area, like sex and anything else, where they can have quarrels. And even people who have financial troubles, even individually, or it could be a couple, that you need to deal with the spiritual cause. Are you covetous? Do you believe that satisfaction lies in material things? Are you lazy? Let's address the spiritual causes and not just let's sit down and make a budget, though I like to sit down and make budgets with people. But there's one of my little books is called Financial Crisis, and it's like, why are you in this mess? But if a couple isn't united in other areas, they're going to have a really difficult time uniting on their finances. And we see cases, I've had cases where, one just spends money as they please and sometimes just annoy the other. And again, that's not a budgeting problem.
Is it good to have a his and hers, or should it all be in one pot, or how does that work?
Yeah. So I think the initial gut reaction we all would have would be it's all ours together. And yet there can be circumstances where I'll give you an example in our marriage. I've been married over 44 years, and I married someone who has a hard time spending money on herself. I realize I'm most blessed among men, and other men have other problems with their wives, but I have to go with my wife shopping to tell her, yes, we can have that. Yes, you should buy that. Yes, we have enough money for that. Again, other men, opposite problems. But one thing we did from the beginning of our marriage, now I started working full time in 1979 after college, but we made our first budget, and there was a category in there to set aside a certain amount of money for Caroline that she could do whatever she wanted to with it. And back then I was making less than $1,500 a month, which was a princely sum in 1979. And and then it could accumulate if she didn't spend it. Now, I will also say what she would do is she'd accumulate it and then use it to buy gifts or do nice things for other people, not herself. But I think there was something to be said to make a budget where you each have access to some money where, like I could turn my camera around. I've got some Spurgeon manuscripts that he hand edited in my office here. And that wasn't a necessity of life. It wasn't the electric bill. So I think there can be a place to have separate money. I mean, I think if a couple is getting along, we just did a counseling session with a couple over financial issues recently, and you make a budget together. Proverbs 21:5, the plans of the diligent lead to advantage. And then you may each have control over different parts of the budget. But if you said, I'm going to spend only $80 a month on eating out, then you keep your word and you don't spend more money. In the Bible, there are examples of women who had independent resources. And I mention this because sometimes there can be a hyper headship mentality among some men that because they're the leader, especially if they're the primary earner, that they have absolute control over all the finances. And often, rather than being servants, they're very selfish with the money. They could be tightwads, or they could even just be, I'm going to spend it on myself and not on you. And so it's interesting that in 1 Samuel 25, when foolish Nabal insults David, and David's about to wipe out everybody in the whole clan, that Abigail has access to resources where she's able to feed an army, and in defiance of her husband's wishes. She knew he said no, and she believed her obligation to God. She's considered to be an exceptionally wise woman who acted quickly with the resources. Also in the Gospel of Luke, there's just this little section where it's describing Jesus' itinerant ministry. And there's just this short little mention at the beginning of chapter 8 that there were women, and it lists Mary, but it even says Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's servant, and Susanna, and many others who are contributing to their support out of their private means. At least some of these women were married and they had private means. And again, general principle, what I tell my wife, it's all ours together. In most of our marriage, she's not worked outside the home. She's worked like crazy inside the home with kids and hospitality. It's all ours together. Again, it's about the relationship. I think you could, again, I'll give you another example. I've seen two cases where a wife would receive a substantial inheritance, and she was married to Nabal. And so she gets this inheritance from her mother or grandmother. Now she's got some six-figure amount, and she's thinking education for kids or other things. And the husband just grabs that money and spends it foolishly, selfishly, in one case even just quit working till he had burned through it all. I think she had the right to keep that money segregated from Nabal. Again, so I think generally speaking, it's all ours together. We should make major financial decisions together. We should have a budget and stick with it. We have things like, whatever, 2 figures. And if it's in the budget, you don't have to ask. And 3 figures, you should ask, or outside the budget. So I think couples have to make up their minds. But there can be unusual circumstances where some separation is allowable. But obviously, the general concern would be usually it's the main earner. We actually counseled a couple where the wife is going to be a medical doctor and the husband is a low-paid ministry worker like us. And she's going to make a whole lot more money than he. And so how do they manage that together? And ideally, they do manage it together, and whether who earns more or not. Again, it's about the relationship even more than the money. If somebody says, I want separate money, what's going on that makes you feel like you need to do that?
Maybe backing up to ask, who should get married? What should parents be looking for when their children start to bring home a significant other? What questions should they ask?
Yeah, well, I love that question. I have all these seminary students, many of whom are single. And so these discussions actually take place around my dinner table. We have a lot of them over. And so even the premise of your question, I would limit a bit, like the money thing, where my understanding is that when you become an adult, that while it is wise to seek the counsel of your parents and to honor your parents, they don't have an absolute and unconditional control over whom you marry. And so if your father's a Muslim or he's an Hamas or something and you want to marry a Christian, he's not going to go for it. And you never stop being a parent. I try to make a case biblically that when people become adults, the role of the parents becomes more of advice than control. And I say that we raised our kids in the homeschool movement, but there were people in the homeschool movement that made it we had cases literally where the son is over 40 years old and the mother thinks he's in absolute subjection and she tries to stop him from getting married. So in an ideal world, and we had a young lady last night who wants to live in the ideal world. And so if a man shows interest in her, she says, I want you to spend some time with my father. And then the father can ask questions she don't want to ask. I think that's the ideal world. The ideal world is the families get to know the person their child is considering, and they fall in love with that person and they approve. I would even say in an ideal world, a wise father would recognize, it's usually the father of the woman, right? Would recognize character flaws in the young man. And I know of cases where a father warned his daughter. And actually, the particular case I'm talking about is this young man came to visit, and the father caught him looking at porn on the family television. It's sin, but it's also incredibly stupid. I think there can be cases where they have wisdom and a good relationship. But even then, I would say it's persuasion. There are situations where parents are super controlling, or even maybe for unbiblical reasons, but just, again, a particular resource I've really appreciated, and I've almost wanted to make it required reading for all the single women I know, is Deepak Reju's book, She's Got the Wrong Guy. And I supervise counseling where my mid-20s women in our program are counseling the late teens, early 20s women at college or something. And Deepak really, I think, was onto something that he says, wise women settle or something. And so I think a woman, especially women, can make an idol out of being married or having a boyfriend. And there'll be a guy who has obvious character flaws. And that would be a great thing for a father and daughter to read, preferably before she thinks she's got a guy. And the lustful guy, the lazy guy, the angry guy. And we've even given that to young women when we've been in the position. Not all fathers want to do this. And so when they came to us, just look this over and evaluate this guy. I will add one more just comment from case wisdom would be a couple comments. One would be if a couple have decided they're crazy about each other, parents need to recognize that you want to tread carefully, because if somebody thinks they're in love, they become extremely defensive about anybody who tries to get between them. And realizing that if this goes on, this is the person who will have major influence over how much you see your child and your grandchildren in the years to come. And so I think they need wisdom. I don't think the approach is to say, I'm your father, mother, and you're going to do what I say. But back to the point, if you have a great relationship with your child and they trust you and you trust them, and they're seeking your wisdom, as Proverbs says, ideally an older child would do from parents, then the parents, I guess I'll ramble on. I will also say that my observation is right now there are a lot more women of marriageable age who are actually marriageable than men. There are a lot of men who don't have nearly the maturity. They don't have jobs or prospects. They're hooked on porn and video games. They don't have ambition. And again, there are some glorious exceptions in our church to this characterization, but I think in general, there is a maturity gap in young men. And I could understand if I was a young woman, I would be tempted to be a bit desperate if I looked around.
Yeah, that's good. I got married a little later. I was a little older when I got married, and I had become pretty content with being single. In fact, I was thinking that was the Lord's call for me, is to be single. How does one go about? How does one know if that's what the Lord has for them? Is singleness, or how do we be content in where we're
Yeah,
at?
that's another great question. In Matthew 19, there's a curious statement by Jesus that summarizes what I observe. Jesus says, when the disciples have heard what Jesus says about divorce and remarriage, he says in verse 12, there are those who are eunuchs who are born that way from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who are made eunuchs by men. There are also eunuchs who made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. He was able to accept this, let him accept it. Now, in the very literal sense, what he says there is true. There are some people born without capability of normal intercourse and marriage. But I think that it also reflects a reality is there are some people who, for the kingdom of God, believe they can best serve God as single. And Paul talks a lot about that in 1 Corinthians 7. And I use 1 Corinthians 7 about verse 32, where it says the married man has to be concerned about pleasing his wife. And that's a double-edged sword, which would be, if you're going to get married, you've got to realize your life's going to change, and a lot of time has to be devoted to caring for your family. And if you're already married, that means to give yourself completely to ministry and neglect your wife is wrong and sinful. And so there's some people that I'm not saying they have no sex drive at all, but if I'm pretty content being single, Paul says it's better to marry than to burn. I'm not, and even it's not just sex, it's loneliness. And just I'm doing well as a single guy, and I really see, or gal, and I can see that I can do more for the Lord. Biblically, the purpose of being single isn't so you can sow your wild oats and not have responsibility. It's so you can serve the Lord better. It doesn't mean you have to be a missionary somewhere, but you use your singleness for the glory of God, and that's good. Single sometimes in the church can feel neglected or used, but I think there's a good attitude to say sometimes the people that have little kids have to rush home, put them down for their nap, and are you willing to stay and clean up after the fellowship meal? And I think churches should acknowledge single people, not just families. So then, but there's another situation that I don't think it's talked about enough, and that is people who want to be married, and this could fall into the category eunuchs from their mother's womb. It's not that they don't have sexual apparatus; it's nobody wants to marry them, and or nobody suitable wants to marry them. And a truism that was coming out of the culture of the courtship and all that my kids grew up in, and I found a lot of good things about that culture. But the idea would be just wait patiently, and God will send Prince Charming to you, or Boaz, or whatever. And someday, if you just wait long enough, the man or woman of your dreams will come into your life and you'll be happily ever after married. And if you just look around the church, some of the single people are single for a reason. It's not because they decided, I think I can serve God better single. It's that I'm lonely, I have sexual desires, and there's no one out there that I would have who would have me. And we know people, women who are 40s, 50s, 60s even, who always thought they would get married, and it didn't happen. And but I also think you're free to be Ruth, not to do exactly what she did, but get yourself out there. But I think for some people, singleness is an unwanted singleness. And maybe you could find somebody willing to marry you, but to be married to certain people is better. It'd be better to be on the corner of a roof. Bad marriage is worse than no marriage. Yeah. So these different circumstances in life, that it's not just a simple answer. That I also think that people who are single ought to make themselves ready to be a godly spouse, to grow spiritually, to grow, especially for a man, to be able to take care of a family, to have maturity that a lot of young men think, I'm going to get married so I can have somebody who'll have sex with me and take care of me. Getting married isn't, from your standpoint, isn't about you fulfilling your dreams. It's about you fulfilling her dreams. To find someone that you can help them to flourish the way God has made them and to fulfill what God has designed them to be. If my answers are too long, just put up a hand and I'll land the plane.
No, we're good. We're good. That's great.
So what about dating then? Is it courtship or dating? What would be some wisdom in doing that?
Yeah, there's a free audio on the IBCD website called How to Avoid Hurting and Getting Hurt in Courtship and Dating. Those are both extra biblical terms. And I think there's some general principles that I'll rattle off a few. Certainly, ideally, you're only intimate with one person in life. But then beyond that, bonds happen between a man and a woman far short of having sexual intercourse together, where you're boyfriend, girlfriend, you hold hands, even holding hands. I still remember the moment I held Caroline's hand for the first time. I asked permission. And that was like 47 years ago or something. And so in an ideal world, I think there's a lot to be said that creating what I would call mini marriages where people pair up, and especially if they're too young to even think about marriage, perhaps. They may not be that mature, but just we're lonely, you want somebody to be with. So they create this little mini marriage that then results in a mini divorce. And there's a sequence of these. And I think that's less than ideal. I think it can often lead to fornication, but even just creating bonds that are broken and hurt. And I had a friend tell me when I was 17, an older friend, who said, one day you'll wish you'd only kissed one person. One day you'll wish you had never said, I love you, and poured out your heart like that to anyone other than the person you married. He also made a statement that if you go out with a girl, treat her the way you hope your future wife is being treated if she's out on a date tonight. These things. And so some people talk about intentional dating, but I can't say it's wrong for men and women to be friends and just, they're single and to have coffee. And sometimes the courtship culture is almost the first time two single people strike up a conversation, they're half a step away from engagement. So I think there should be ways for men and women to talk to each other, get to know each other before you start trying to pursue. I think that it's important that both sides understand the nature of the relationship at each stage, because sometimes what is a friendly conversation to one person is important to the other. But I think that creating boyfriend-girlfriend relationships that don't have a purpose have a lot of danger to it and future hurt and regret. But some would call it intentional dating. That you're not just dating to have a girlfriend, you're not just dating to hang out. You can hang out with people if you want to hang out with them. But if you're developing a relationship that's more serious, it's not to be serious just to enjoy some of the benefits of marriage without the commitment. You're investigating, whether you call it courtship or intentional dating, is this something that could lead to marriage? But you mentioned like involvement of parents. I had a wise friend who had a great statement. He said that he says to young men, if you're interested in a girl, ask her, what are the customs in your tribe? In some tribes, it's you go talk to the dad and have dinner with the family before you ever go on a date. I tried that with Caroline's dad. He said, why are you talking to me? But I think, again, having some purpose. I've got one story where there was a guy in our church, single guy, was a bit lonely. And he remembered a girl that he had dated a bit in college and he'd not seen her in a while. And he really realized this person would make a great wife. She was serving as a missionary at the time, short-term missionary. And he was so wrote her to make contact again. And she had shown interest in him when they were in college, but they hadn't had much contact since then. And he wrote her and she said, why are you writing me? And he wrote back, I thought we should be friends. And she said, I got plenty of friends. And so he had to lay his cards on the table and say that he wasn't just, and they're now missionaries together in Latin America with a bunch of kids. But yeah, I thank God. Carolyn and I decided very young we wanted to marry each other. We've married over 44 years. When I see what people are going through, And I think it's harder now than it was then. I'm just so thankful I haven't had to worry about this in a very long time.
So you find your Prince Charming and dating goes well and you get married and then there's problems. Now what do you do?
You go back to the people who did your pre-marriage counseling and say, why didn't you prepare me for this? It depends on what the problems are. I love Dave Harvey's book, When Sinners Say I Do. I have my students read it, and I would have a lot of people preparing for marriage or shortly after marriage to read it. It basically says the biggest sinner you know is you. You're chief of sinners, and you're married to sinners. So, you need to realize that two people can get along. Dating world is Disney World. It's unrealistic. Living together in close quarters, having to deal in depth with money, sex, everything else. There's going to be conflict. It's unavoidable. And so part of growing marriage is not just designed by God to make us happy. It's also designed by God to make us holy. Probably his priority is that. And so marriage teaches you what a sinner you are. Marriage also reminds you that you married a sinner and it's your opportunity to show grace to them. I think that a lot of the couples we deal with, we try to teach a lot of basic peacemaking skills and get the log out of your own eye, Matthew 7. Learn how to gently restore your spouse rather than judging them in Galatians 6. Understanding forgiveness from Matthew 18. And so sometimes I think it can help. In Philippians 4, it was two women, but when they couldn't get along, Paul said, yoke fellow, whoever that it was, help these women. And so I often have couples I jokingly call it a prenup, where before you're married, you agree that if either one of you thinks things need help, that you agree that you'll go get godly counsel. I think it's great when couples counsel couples also. So you have a wife there in the room who has the perspective of the young wife. That's a start.
I have a friend that him and his wife, they just started when they were young, when they were first married, going to see a marriage counselor every, I don't know how often they do it, every 6 months or whatever, just to get in a habit of talking to somebody about their relationship. Is preventative maintenance.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
I think ideally counseling takes place in the church. And I think there are different levels of counseling. There can be crisis counseling where you need people who are really very mature and well trained. There's discipleship where you need people who are pretty mature and pretty well trained. And there's the casual way we speak into each other's lives that everybody should be doing, Romans 15:14. And I think the best people to counsel you are ordinarily the people you're doing life with, and not somebody you're paying $150 an hour to buy 50 minutes of their time once a month or something. So I think ideally you would have an older couple. Carolyn and I were tremendously influenced even during courtship by spending time with couples who are happily married. Looking back, our parents' marriages, I now say, are better than I thought they were at the time. They stayed married till death parted them. They largely fulfilled their roles. When you're 18, 20 years old, you think you know everything and you're going to be so much better than they are. But we didn't have parents who had the kind of God-centered marriage with prayer and devotions and all that. And so we really were benefited by not just finding a bunch of people our own age who don't know what they're doing, but enjoying time with couples with happy marriages. And rather than sitting down for a counseling session, if you're at level 3, get level 3 help. But if you're level 1 or 2, we've had couples come to us and say, can we just come over and hang out with you once a month and just talk? And it doesn't have to be this super intense, you're on the couch and we're going to go at it together. Sometimes that's necessary, but my recommendation would be find who did your pre-marriage counseling. If they're in your church, just spend time with them informally and things will come up.
That's good. That's good advice. Now that we've talked about happy marriages and how to have a happy marriage, what about divorce? That is a sad reality. Is it ever okay?
Yeah. When I first started pastoral ministry and I started having people invite us to do their pre-marriage counseling and for me to do their wedding, I remember thinking, I never want to do a wedding for people who will divorce. And I realized that's something I have absolutely no control over. And there are people, actually, there are 2 cases where I refused to do the wedding because I just felt there were so many problems in their relationship. But there are people that I couldn't see any reason why they couldn't get married who later turned towards sin and they're now sadly divorced. I love the clarity of how the scripture teaches, even how Jesus explains in Matthew 19 that God under the old covenant regulated divorce. He said because of their hardness of heart. In a fallen world, people are going to abandon their marriage covenants, period. And you can make, in the Philippines, there's a law saying you can't divorce, but people are still functionally divorcing and functionally remarrying. So there's going to be divorce. The church can't stop it. The government can't stop it. Now, biblically, for a believer, we want to honor God and obey his word. And Jesus says, what God has joined, let no man separate. You don't want to be the one to break the covenant and to separate the covenant. But Jesus also gives that whoever divorces his wife except for immorality and marries another woman commits adultery, is that he's given the exception that the other person sexually being unfaithful is potential grounds for it. Doesn't make you divorced, but it gives you the right to choose the divorce. And in 1 Corinthians 7, as if you're abandoned by an unbeliever, and those exceptions are really regulating the terrible things that are going to happen in a fallen world. You can have a godly person who really wants to save the marriage, and if the other person is going to go shack up with somebody else, or is going to leave, or is going to beat them, or all these other things, God has provided even through divorce, protection for the innocent party, not to be bound to this person who has no interest in keeping the covenant. Again, in my marriage, divorce, and remarriage book, I try to go through the tricky I don't know if you're going to ask me the hard questions, but what constitutes sexual sin that rises to that level? What constitutes abandonment? Most people agree that abuse can rise to that level. And there are hard situations. I think one of the most interesting that's the summary answer. Something that has been interesting to me, especially as I've dealt with a lot of cases of horrible marital conflict that many would label as abuse, is Paul has these curious, sometimes you read stuff like I did with the passage in Matthew 19, and I see how the wisdom of this might apply in certain situations I hadn't thought of before, where he says that the wife should not leave her husband, but if she does leave, she must either remain married or else be reconciled. And that was always curious to me, because I thought churches just disciplined you if you left without us agreeing. But here, Paul is assuming not that this person, 1 Corinthians 5, is outside, so no longer listening. This person is still listening to Paul, assuming they're still in some sense in. He doesn't say to rush towards excommunication. And it fits situations I've seen where, again, I have 3 levels when it comes to abuse, for example. I've got lots of 3s, but there's just ordinary marital conflict where people sometimes are looking for an excuse to get out. There's no way they should leave. There is blood and bruises and broken bones, but also extreme coercion and mistreatment that if you were my sister, I'd say run for your life. There's these things in the middle where it's pretty bad. This person is somewhat oppressive, and I can't tell you to leave, but I don't think you should have. But if you leave, stay single or be reconciled. But I can't tell you're not allowed to leave. And I think churches need to be extraordinarily cautious about disciplining someone under those circumstances, because you don't even know what's really going on in the house to begin with. You see smoke, you don't know how big the fire is, and you don't know how much the fire is going to spread if there is smoke. So it's very humbling. We all want black and white answers. This is exactly when you can leave. This is exactly when you can't. I think that it's usually the woman. It could be I've had a case where it's the man being oppressed this way. I think can exercise freedom to get away from an oppressive situation, even short of divorce and remarriage. And they have agency or choice in that we can't always compel.
Yeah, I appreciate your answer. I actually have written down here, that does abuse come underneath abandonment, and then what constitutes abuse? I think in our day, that question, and I like you said there's people that are just, you can tell they're looking for a way out, and so that abuse in our day is what they go to.
I don't know if you're aware. I keep referring to books. I make almost no money on So if anybody buys my book, I could buy coffee maybe or something. But the most recent thing I wrote was with ACBC called The Abuse Pendulum. And the pendulum part is that when I first started ministry in the 80s, that there was no fault divorce and expanding grounds for divorce. And so Christians generally were in the posture of defending marriage against those who had abandoned it too quickly. And there was a failure sometimes to recognize that there can be oppression that doesn't necessarily cause physical injury in situations where a person who is being oppressed has the freedom to get away. And I've had to go back to women really primarily from the 90s, like half a dozen, just saying, I put a lot of pressure on you to stay in a situation that I realize now that I wouldn't have told you to leave, but I would have said, I think you have the freedom to make a choice here. My concern would be if the pendulum on one side was protecting marriage and not doing a good enough job of protecting victims. In reaction against that, I'm concerned it swung to the other extreme. And a lot of extra biblical or unbiblical ideas from the world, Me Too, psychology, have been imported. Now you've got even people claiming to be biblical counselors or Christian counselors who have adopted things that are the other extreme. In the mini book, I go through several things, but one example would be we're told always believe the victim or always believe the woman. Potiphar's wife was believed, and Joseph spent years in prison. And women also are sinners who lie. And they know the power right now to make an accusation. And so I've got 7 things like that I understand we should always take an allegation seriously. We should always keep people safe if they think they're unsafe, if I can't prove. But I can't treat someone as guilty without meeting a biblical standard of proof, which means there are going to be lots of cases we don't really know what's happening. On the divorce remarriage thing, I would say if this woman is convinced she's in danger, unless I have proof she's lying like crazy, I would say by all means get out of danger. But if I don't have proof of the husband actually committing some heinous acts, I can't punish him, even from a church standpoint. But I think Wayne Grudem wrote a paper trying to say abuse was a third ground of divorce. And I gave a talk about this recently. And I think he's right that abuse is a ground. I think it fits within abandonment, where I think abandonment isn't just you move out. If you're using her as a punching bag and a sex object, you don't want to leave. And I know cases like she's making $80,000 a year and you're not working. Of course, you don't want to leave. I think abandonment is walking away from the fundamental responsibilities of marriage. It's not imperfection, but it's a fundamental breach. So part of that would be she has a right to be safe, but there can be other forms that I think. So yeah, yes, abuse at a certain level, but it gets back to that 1, 2, 3 thing. Is that 3? Clearly, she ought to get away. 1, let's try to do some marriage counseling and not rush off. And I'm concerned with the abuse pendulum that some women, they look at a list, are you being abused? And yeah, my husband does 6 of those things. In some cases, ma'am, I could go through the list and you do 7 of them sometimes. And then it's like critical theory that the men can do no right, the women can do no wrong because the men have the power. That's not how the Bible expresses things. Both sides are tempted to certain sins. And so I think there's a risk now because the pendulum has swung that way, and you have people who have done, in some ways, a very fine job of protecting real victims who are being protected from great harm. But I'm afraid that sometimes what's called abuse or trauma gets expanded to what would be ordinary sin and marital conflict, and that you're almost told you can't bring up the sins of the party who is allegedly oppressed. And yet there are cases where those are pretty significant.
I wanted to end on a positive note. How would the law gospel distinction help our marriages, and how would it give hope for ones that aren't that healthy?
Okay, I like your question. I think fundamentally, one of the great problems in many marriages is they operate on law without gospel. And so I will treat you as well as you treat me. I will treat you according to what you deserve. And bringing grace into marriage is, if I'm supposed to love my wife as Christ loved the church, Christ loves me even when I fall short. That my standing with Christ is not based upon my merit, but my standing with God is based upon merit of Christ. So I love my wife, and I'm more Christ-like when my wife is a disappointment to me and isn't meeting my expectations than when it's easy to be Christ-like when she's doing everything right. I would say from a personal standpoint, another way I would look at the law gospel distinction would be that when I fail and fall short, it makes me thankful that my standing before God is not based upon my being a perfect husband. And I'm also thankful that I have a wife who is so full of grace that she is very good to me sometimes when I deserve bad. And I know the Bible specifically says, and my desire would be my wife would look at me and say, I think I understand how Christ loves me graciously, not based on merit because of how Jim treats me. But even more so, I can say coming the other way is that when Caroline is exceptionally kind to me when I know I really don't, I deserve wrath or I deserve the couch or whatever, and she's still kind to me, that we're reflecting the gospel to each other. So I don't know if there's more you wanted me to say about that, I could keep going, but those are the things that pop into my mind.
That's great. Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks so much for joining us today and talking about this really important subject that I think is going to be a great help to our listeners. And we'll put links to your books in our show notes, and maybe you'll get a coffee at the deal or something.
Take my wife out. Yeah.
So thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you. It's been an honor to be invited.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening. You can find more out about us or check out past episodes on the web at renewalcast.com. You can connect with us on social media. For instance, you can go to facebook.com/renewalcast. Have a great week.